I didn't know that about the Daily Telegraph. Perhaps I'm glad I didn't know it. I once did a degree in mathematics, and looking back it was a complete waste of time. Apart from teaching me one thing, when in doubt, revert to first principles. So I want to do that in 15 minutes. I'm going to speak here this afternoon in the sort of, I guess, the twilight of the day's proceedings. Western civilization is a tripod that stands on three legs, three crucial legs. One is the economy, the capitalist industrialised economy. One is the political order, the liberal democratic political order. Both of those two legs, this is a mixed metaphor I'm afraid, are alive and well. They're completely unproblematic in terms of their future, and I'm not going to talk about them. Significantly enough, given this morning's discussion, both of them were created in England through the English Industrial Revolution and the long development of parliamentary democracy in England, and that fact is not to be underestimated. The third leg is the cultural leg, Western culture. I need to make a couple of discriminations when talking about Western culture because this is the area in which the problems reside. A very important part of any culture are its moral laws, its ethical component, the thou shalt nots, which are obviously central to ancient Judaism. Morality is unproblematic in the modern West. And we just look around at the society, look at Australia. Australia today is an extraordinarily law-abiding society with very, very low crime rates by any realistic historical standards. People treat each other by and large very decently, and this is as just a society as we've virtually ever seen in human history. That dimension of culture, morality, the ethical, is not a problem. The other area of culture, and which is in a sense even more important with all civilisations and cultures, is the sort of area of the big truths, the capital T truths, the stories that a culture has to generate to give its people a sense of who they are and that their lives are meaningful. Stories that also will tell them that their death, stories about death, that death is not just a meaningless end to everything. Now, every culture generates stories, usually from a long time ago, what the Australian Aborigines call the dreaming stories. I think the Aborigines are absolutely right in their theory of culture. Every culture comes out of big archetypal stories from a long time ago, which we then retell. I mean, the West stories are very, very different from the Aboriginal stories. Cultures vary, they're not the same. Sticking to first principles, the central task of cultural elites is to retell the big stories in ways that speak to new times. Stories become out of date. They stop speaking. The task of every cultural elite, it's what ancient Judaism called midrash, the process of midrash, is to retell stories in the ways that they speak today. Now, there's been this extraordinary thing in Western high culture, which is where most of the big stories come from the Homers, the Shakespeares, the Jesus narratives written in virtuoso Greek 2,000 years ago. It's out of high culture, out of the cultural elites that these stories are generated and need to be retold. Now, another distinction I want to make here between high culture and popular culture. I don't think there's any problem with the health and well-being, vitality of popular culture in the modern West. And popular culture spends some time in television, soap opera, films, other places, retelling big stories and certainly reinforcing traditional public morality. It does a very good job. The problem's in high culture. In the West, we've had this strange development over the last 150 years that the mainstream of high culture, the most talented philosophers, artists, writers, musicians, the most talented of them all, have taken to a very, very negative view of the human condition. And basically, they've abdicated their central responsibility of retelling the big stories to help people with tragedy and with the ups and downs, the tediums of the human condition. And they've turned into describing human life as a sort of living death, where life's absurd, death is death, there's no great point in being here, and contaminated views of community and nation with a similar sort of nihilistic, we believe in nothing, view of the human condition. You've had numbers of examples of this today. Let me just give three. I don't want to overdo the examples of cultural nihilism. My talk is basically optimistic. The obvious one, in a way, from the 20th century is Marcel Duchamp in 1917 entering a urinal in an art exhibition in New York. He bought a porcelain urinal, entered it in the art exhibition, caused a scandal. This was a very, very serious act of cultural desecration, because what Duchamp was doing, he was saying basically, there are no standards left in the modern West. This is how nihilistic this is. There are no standards left in the modern West where you can tell me my urinal is less beautiful than a Raphael Madonna, is less true than a Raphael Madonna, is less good than a Raphael Madonna. No such standards exist anymore, and at least my urinal, at least if it got plumbed, is useful. Duchamp won. I mean, you only have to go to the prestigious art galleries of the Western world, including in Australia, and certainly galleries of contemporary art, to see that virtually every new exhibition is basically urinals, wall-to-wall urinals, less witty. No sensible person will ever visit one of these exhibitions, but the cultural elites keep them going and keep praising them as extraordinarily insightful and so forth. Second example, John Hurst talked this morning about Australian universities. It is true that the humanities, arts areas, which are the creative areas in terms of the ideas and stories are concerned, have been captured. Not entirely, and maybe less true today than 20 years ago, but have been captured by a sort of neo-Marxist view that the West is evil. This is really nihilistic, that our society is evil, and as a result, English departments now don't teach Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Homer, and certainly not Patrick White, I think arguably our greatest writer. They teach courses on underprivileged minorities that have been persecuted by the West. I mean, particularly the Americans, if you're doing these courses in Australia, but also the Australians. This is cultural masochism. This is a pathological cultural condition. My third example, the Vietnam War and Iraq War. What society in history has had a significant component of its elites wanting its own side to lose a war? What society in history has had a significant component of its elites wanting its own society to lose a war? I'm talking about worse than cultural masochism. That was true with the Vietnam War, it's true with the Iraq War. And I mean, recently in this country, the celebration of David Hicks is exactly the same sort of nihilistic cultural masochism. The celebration of David Hicks at the Sydney Writers' Festival and on ABC Radio National. I mean, David Hicks was basically committed terrorist acts of one form or another over 2 years. He fought in a war in which we were fighting on one side, he was on the other side. That is traditionally called treason, and yet he's now celebrated in very serious components of the Australian cultural elites as a sort of national hero. National hero, of course, because he was persecuted by those evil Americans. Now, this is one story of high culture. There's a battle, as always. Culture is always a war, and it's a war that we have to fight and we lose at our peril. And a positive example. This city, Melbourne, if you walk around the CBD today and the environments of the CBD, this is a far more attractive city than 20 years ago. The cafes, the alleys, the hubbub of life and dynamism and colour and vitality that you will find in the laneways of the city of Melbourne is extraordinary, and a sense of an exuberant, confident society that likes itself. Similarly, the redesign of the landscaping redesign from Federation Square to the Melbourne Cricket Ground and the other sporting complexes over to the Arts Centre. If you walk through those gardens, across the bridges, along the river, this is an extraordinarily beautiful piece of landscape architecture, which I think we can be duly proud of. I think similarly, Sydney has pieces of virtuoso landscape design. Now, this is in the great tradition we have in the West from the Greeks of creating beautiful cities, of believing that the good life depends on living in a beautiful city with sporting performances. We're good at them. Sporting performances in which we go and watch people of extraordinary ability carrying out what the Greeks called beautiful rhythm. That is all alive and well in our society today. So I certainly, and sort of unlike the Giles Orty, would not be altogether pessimistic, and in fact not very pessimistic about high culture, in spite of the examples that one can cite. Let me shift ground, continental Europe. Western culture is not just out of the Anglo-sphere. I know there was a certain amount of exaggeration this morning. The Catholic Church based in Italy has played a major role. I mean, I don't even need to say this, in the positives of Western civilization over nearly 2,000 years. The Italian Renaissance, there's German philosophy, German music. Today, I think we are witnessing the rapid decline of continental Europe. And this may be serious for the morale of the West. The two things I would note is demography. The birth rates in Germany, Spain and Italy, not to mention Greece, are catastrophically low. The fertility rate's at 1.3, so the average number of children the average woman's going to have in a lifetime is 1.3. Demographers tell me if the fertility rate goes beneath 1.4, you can't recover, because even if you want to, there aren't enough women who are young enough to have children. Continental Europe, at least those countries, the French birth rate is a good bit higher, but it's largely because of the 15% of the country that's Muslim, which raises problems of another sort, which I don't want to go into here. A country that is so demoralised that it can't even bother to reproduce itself. I mean, what sort of... I'm talking about elites that want your own country to lose a war. Even more, a society that has so little believes in itself anymore that the sort of the basic biological urge of survival and reproduction is sinking out of existence. What does that tell us? The other thing I would mention about continental Europe is sovereign debt. Maybe it's not unrelated. It's not just Greece, it's Spain, Portugal, Italy, maybe other countries too, and Britain has major problems on this front. Countries that have had such irresponsible political elites that they're now wallowing in national debt, which most of those countries are going to find it near impossible to escape from. That's another sign of decline, demoralisation. I agree with the speakers this morning who are emphasising the Anglo-sphere. I think we've got very good reason to be more optimistic about the Anglo-sphere led by the United States. The birth rate's fine. Actually, the birth rate in Britain is fine too, and the birth rate in Australia has been going up over the last six years. We don't have problems with our birth rate. With the European example, culture has very deep roots which, again, this isn't a mixed metaphor, but go back a long way in time. If some of the most important roots, as in continental Europe, wither, and I think that is currently happening. It's currently happening a lot more rapidly than you would have thought 10 years ago. If they wither, what consequences for the confidence of the civilization and the culture will that have? Confidence in the United States and in other members of the Anglo-sphere like ourselves. The major negative in my perception of the United States at present would be a sort of paralysis in the political elites, especially over recovering from the GFC. That is far outweighed by the basic positive fact about the United States in terms of, I think, thinking about civilization. Today, it is by far the most creative society on earth. And by so far, it doesn't matter. You've got to look at how many of the world's best universities are in the United States? Almost all of them. Numbers of Nobel Prizes have been mentioned. How many major technological inventions or breakthroughs of the last 20 years have not come out of the United States? I would suggest the most deep and interesting artistic reflections on the human condition in the last decade or two have been produced by American cable television in series like The Sopranos and Deadwood. These are very deep. This is high culture at its greatest level. Also, the United States, not unimportantly, has very large military forces and very capable military forces. Ultimately, and again, this is a sort of mysterious factor in all of this, we in the Anglo-sphere, in terms of first principles, we haven't lost a major war since Wellington defeated Napoleon. The Industrial Revolution, parliamentary democracy came out of England. The world we live in today is almost entirely created out of our own culture. And on top of that, English is the lingua franca. Now, I suspect this creates a sort of implicit confidence, in contrast to the French, implicit confidence about we made this world. And, sort of we're good. We're good at civilization. And success bespeaks that. This is only going to go wrong, and I don't think it'll be explicitly because of China. This is only going to go wrong because of loss of morale and loss of confidence from within. Civilizations decline because of collapse, internal collapse. The fish start stinking from the head. Elites that become more and more corrupt, paralysed, or masochistic. Thank you.